Okay, so today we are talking about neoliberalism, but in order to understand neoliberalism, I think it's important to first try and define the term liberalism or liberal, because I think it gets used in a lot of different ways. And I think depending on the context and sort of what position you're coming from, the understanding of the meaning of the term can sort of move around a little bit. So there is kind of this idea of like liberalism as sort of all Western democracies are sort of liberal democracies, right? So United States, UK, Western Europe, basically the NATO allies that opposed the Soviet Union during the Cold War are all sort of like the liberal countries, right? And that's kind of correct. There's also sort of this dichotomy between liberal and conservative that I think people talk about a lot when they talk about American politics, where you have, the Republicans on the one hand are conservative and then the Democrats are liberal. But sort of in the context that we're talking about it, both Democrats and Republicans all kind of fall under sort of this greater umbrella of liberalism. But I think the key point to understand when we talk about liberalism in this conversation is that we're not really talking about either of these two ideas of Democrat versus Republican liberalism, or, well, I guess in some ways we are talking about sort of like the Western capitalists, but when we talk about neoliberalism specifically, it's talking about liberalism with respect to the market, right? So free market economics, or liberal sort of economic policies, and so you should really be thinking about sort of free trade, those kinds of ideas when we're thinking about liberalism in the context of neoliberalism, right? So I did the cheap college essay thing, and I pulled out what is liberalism from I don't think it's Webster, it's just Google, I think, but it says liberalism in politics is associated with non-authoritarianism, the rule of law, constitutional government with limited powers, and the guarantee of civil and political liberties. A liberal society is tolerant of different religions, philosophical and ethical doctrines, and allows individuals to freely form and express their conscientious convictions and opinions on matters and live according to their chosen purposes and life paths, right? All of that sounds good. All of that sounds fun. All of that is basically the kinds of things that you learn in like elementary school as like the basis of like American constitutional democracy, right? All of that stuff has roots kind of in the Enlightenment and stuff like that. And so, individual life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, those kinds of things, those are all like liberal values. But in economic terms, basically what liberalism is it's associated with an unplanned economy, free and competitive markets, and private ownership and control of productive resources, right? So the concept of like liberal economic construction is deeply connected to the sort of Enlightenment movement of having these sort of individual liberties. While the marketing of that first part sounds really good, I think we'll come to see throughout this thing how liberalism can be used to oppress us. So what is neoliberalism, right? So I think there's a number of different ways to approach the definition of this term. So I'm going to go through some of them here. Basically, when you hear the word neoliberalism itself in the current political discourse, it largely is used by people on the left, so socialists, communists, real left-wing people, as like an insult against people who are Democrats or people who are in the center right. So people like Nancy Pelosi, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, those kinds of people who are sort of left in the sense that they're not Republicans, but not really meaningfully left in the sense of Marxism or any of the things that we've discussed in any way. So it's funny because the people who actually are neoliberals rarely use that term to describe themselves, right? It's usually used for whatever reason pejoratively by people on the left to describe people to the right of themselves. It is also just kind of a catch-all term to describe what has basically happened in the historical period following the economic crises of the 1970s, right? So the period of neoliberalism is basically 1970s to the present, or like really got going during the Reagan administration, from the Reagan administration to now. So sometimes people really use the term to just describe the political economy of this most recent period in history that we're continuing to live through today. But at its core, what neoliberalism is, it's an ideology, right? It's an ideology that puts the free market above all and prescribes aggressive deregulation, austerity, and the general rollback of the social safety net, right? So it's all the stuff that sort of Republicans unabashedly, advocate for, and Democrats kind of like still concede while maybe positioning that they're against, but really fundamentally still believe in. But it's about free markets. It's about, getting rid of the EPA, getting rid of the post office, privatizing the post office. It's about cracking down on Greece and making you do budget cuts to schools because there's not enough money yet. It's about all those people who complain about the budget, right? It's all of those things that are tied together by this general economic ideology, right? But connected to it, it's not only an economic project, it's a political project as well, right? And it's sort of having these ideas about free market economics and supply side economics, and sort of a concerted effort by the capitalist class in the United States to actually capture government, right? So the neoliberal period is defined by that's what you really don't see, the amounts of money going into politics from corporate America until the neoliberal period, right? That's one of the defining characteristics is the Koch brothers giving billions of dollars, like, right? It costs $1 billion to run for president, right? So that kind of amount of corporate involvement in politics and subservience of the Western capitalist democracies to capital is really, really a feature of this neoliberal period. And people also refer to this period as late stage capitalism. So like capitalism, and it maybe basically just looked a little bit different in its earlier forms, like the capitalism that Marx sort of wrote about and talked about really doesn't, there's a significant number of differences to when when capitalism has matured and has been the system that we've been living under for 200 years or so or whatever, that things start to look different. So late stage capitalism is also kind of a term that you can kind of think of as synonymous with neoliberalism, right? So to understand sort of like what happened, in order to understand neoliberalism, right, we have to understand the period that immediately preceded it, right? And so the period that immediately preceded the neoliberal period is referred to as the post-war period, right? So it's 1945 to 1970, approximately 1973, I think actually is what people say. And what's important to know about this period is that is a period of unparalleled economic prosperity, right? So like things were very, very, very good in the United States from 1945 to 1970, right? People had jobs, wages were increasing, the GIs came home from World War II and like fucked a lot, and everybody bought a house and everybody went to college, and college cost a nickel, and you could buy a house in San Francisco for like $37, and like everything was just fucking copacetic, and the period was just a really, really strong period of economic growth, right? So why was this the case, right? Because God chose us. I mean, I think that kind of was an idea. Sounds ridiculous kind of to say right now, but that was an idea that was definitely like in the ether, right? Especially in the Cold War, where it was sort of like us godful capitalists versus those godless atheist communists, right? So that was an idea that people had in their mind. Another idea was that it's kind of our karmic reward for defeating the Nazis, right? There's this mythology that like we did World War II and we beat the Nazis and we were heroes and we came back and then we were all kind of rewarded for that. There was also a lot of in the academic arenas, there was this idea that capitalism just naturally produces prosperity for all people, right? And that the system of the free market really is the system that produces the most benefit and prosperity for all, right? And that's an idea too. But I think when you zoom out a little bit and look at it in a historical materialist way, you can realize that the real reason that this period was so good is that because all other industrialized countries on Earth were destroyed by World War II, right? Like coming out of World War II and coming out of the Depression, like the historical factors basically all lined up in a way that made America the richest country on Earth for that period. And it's not really natural to expect that level of prosperity under capitalism to exist outside of those conditions, right? So that's the point I want to get across with that. But another very, very, very important factor which guaranteed or helped ensure prosperity for large amounts of people, the working class in general, in the United States in the post-war period, was just a really, really strong labor movement, right? I think labor or union membership in the United States peaked during the early 1950s, right? You had the ILGWU, you had AFL-CIO, you had the United Farm Workers. You have lots of unions, lots of union membership, lots of strikes going on. United Auto Workers in Detroit doing stuff, and basically there's a very, very strong correlation between unions and wages, right? More unions, higher wages for the working class. Pretty simple. There was also just a lot of sort of labor protections and other, government programs, regulations, like the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, was created during the New Deal. Basically, lots of things that are left over from the New Deal that are sort of good leftist things, right? So you had things like the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which was created to regulate Wall Street. You have, the Works Progress Administration, things that are approaching what you might call today like a jobs guarantee, where you are just telling people like, we need to do stuff, let's build stuff, let's give people jobs. You get the NLRB, and basically just throughout, the early part of the 20th century and in this post-war period, you kind of have more government intervention, more regulation to protect consumers, and stronger labor protections in general, right? EPA, OSHA, and other regulatory agencies are created during the 60s and early 70s as well. Those are all good organizations that are meant to protect us from sort of the bad effects of capitalism, right? And there was just a general consensus that the state and the government did have a significant role to play in making people's lives better outside of the market, right? Outside of the way that the market functions, and also as a way to limit the destructive side effects of capitalism, right? So things were good. I think it's really important to also note that this is the period that people are talking about when they say they want to make America great again, right? It's important to note that this is the time period in which baby boomers were children. And so I think everybody sort of is nostalgic, and it's easy to romanticize things about your childhood because you don't understand what's really happening. But it also is important to understand that this was an objectively prosperous time for most people in general. Obviously, things weren't great if you were Black, and there, there's obviously not. It wasn't great for everyone, but in aggregate, I think it's important to realize that this period of prosperity and this period of economic sort of just wealth and rising living standards really impacted everybody during the post-war period. And in a lot of ways, we've just been trying to get back there since then. So what happened during the 1970s, right? Well, there's a number of things which it probably won't behoove me to go into too much detail about exactly why and how this economic crisis occurred in the 1970s. But basically, all that good stuff that I was talking about kind of like fell off in the 1970s, right? So in 1971, U.S. ends the gold standard and is free to expand the money supply. In 1973, there's a financial crisis triggered by an OPEC oil embargo, and that basically caused what they call stagflation, which is inflation, which means that your money is worth less and less every year, and that's paired with no real economic growth. So we're not actually producing more things, but your money is getting worth less and less. So that was very bad, and it made things very difficult for people. This is a picture of people in line for gas because there was no gas and you couldn't get any gas and it was really expensive. And basically the economy really just cratered for a majority of the 1970s. And it really, really caused a lot of people to start rethinking sort of the structures of the government and sort of the underlying assumptions about the way that the economy functions that they have been going on up until this point, right? Another concept that I probably just don't have time to really go into and discuss too much is the falling rate of profit. But basically, this is a concept that Marx himself came up with, but basically the idea that, capitalism makes money, but the amount of profit that you can make sort of has this natural tendency to go down a little bit over time, or a lot over time. And so in order to make more profits, or in order to continue to make the same profits that you did before, you have to continue to like either conquer new territory or conquer new markets, or sort of like expand. And so as we get to late stage capitalism, there just isn't as much left to like squeeze out. There aren't any new frontiers to exploit. There's no, Western frontier to continue to conquer. There's not as much new land and new markets to exploit. And so that adds an additional layer of pressure on the capitalist system itself. But also you can just see it as sort of a return to earth from this, it's a natural end to the unnatural post-war period, right? That amount of prosperity that I think a lot of Americans, and you hear a lot of boomers kind of feel entitled to, that level of prosperity, really wasn't the natural sort of way, or the natural sort of settling point of capitalism. And so, in many ways, the worsening of conditions is sort of a return to what can be seen as the more stable equilibrium of capitalism, as opposed to the unbridled growth and happiness of the post-war period, right? So this is a tectonic shift, and in a lot of ways, I think American history, this is a big line that you draw into like the sort of the period before this and the period after this. So what happens at the end of the 70s? We get Ronald motherfucking Reagan, who's literally, I'm just gonna go ahead and say it, hot take. Basically, I think that he's the worst president of all time. I think he's definitely worse than the Cheeto. I think that without Ronald Reagan, you don't get the Cheeto, right? Because he really kind of started and planted the seed for almost all of the things that we kind of understand now to have kind of fully matured and have come home to roost, sort of, that we have. But he's a goddamn movie star, right? So that sounds familiar. And basically, this is a quote from his first inauguration. It says, "In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem," right? So this ethos really, really, runs throughout the entire Reagan administration, that we need to sort of strip down, dismantle all those good things and all those protections that I discussed in the previous slides, right? Dismantle labor, dismantle all kind of environmental regulations, dismantle all kinds of financial regulations that were put into place after the Great Depression, and really just try to get big government out of the way of like business, so that business can have the liberty and the freedom to do whatever the fuck it wants, right? And so we have this during the Reagan administration is really the classic period when people start talking about the real ideology of neoliberalism sort of coming to the fore, becoming sort of the dominant ideology of our United States government, right? So the Chicago boys are sometimes what they refer to, but these are people like Milton Friedman, who formed the academic basis of neoliberal economics. Some other terms that you may hear around to describe these kinds of economics are trickle-down economics, right? So that's a term that people will say a lot. Some people just call it Reaganomics. That's a common one. Supply-side economics is another term that people use. Which basically means you need to focus on like suppliers, who are basically corporations, and make things easier for suppliers. So basically tax cuts for corporations, or sometimes it's referred to as like neoclassical economics. So those things all have slightly different meanings, but anytime you hear any of those terms, you can basically think about that we're talking about neoliberalism, right? So these academics kind of form the fundamental basis for believing that this is the way that economies should work, right? And that if they do sort of work this way without sort of stripping away all regulations and government restrictions, that they will somehow magically create prosperity for everyone, right? It's interesting to note that the US first works to implement these policies not in the United States, right? Because in the United States, people would object to the suffering that these policies cause. And first and foremost, they tried to implement these policies in countries like Chile, and countries that we basically did coups in during the Cold War, and then basically sent in our economists and our corporations in order to exploit these countries and sort of put these policies in their most extreme and pure form in a way that the people of the United States really would not tolerate. But obviously later on, we basically get all of these same policies sort of coming home to roost. Under Reagan, these ideas, which were formerly fringe and kind of extreme, become very mainstream and become really the core of the American Republican Party. And then once you get from into the 80s and into the 90s with the Clinton years, these ideas really do come to dominate and capture the entire Democratic Party establishment as well. So people like mostly the Clintons, right, are to blame, you know, for this kind of capture of the Democratic Party, where, you know, where in the past the Democratic candidates might have gotten a lot of their campaign funding from unions directly. Now they're taking money, you know, you look at the top donors to the Democratic Party and it's, you know, it's all corporations, right? Whether it's pharmaceuticals, healthcare is one of the big, you know, biggest money donors to the Democratic Party. And so, yeah, we're now to a point where sort of these neoliberal ideas about deregulation and about the essentialness of the market, and sort of the inherent moral rightness of the decisions that the market makes are really, really fundamentally embedded into both our Democratic and Republican parties. So yeah, that's basically what I was just saying. Bipartisan consensus that government is the enemy, deregulation is good, right? And labor is crushed, right? So union membership has cratered since the 1970s. Most people, you know, aren't in the union. I would doubt that anybody on this call is probably in a union. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But you know, very, very low labor participation, and the unions that we do have really don't have their teeth in terms of really having high levels of communist membership or having any type of militant revolutionary leftist ideology in it at all. So a lot of the things I'm describing, a lot of things is a little bit difficult to understand, but what are the things that make neoliberalism actually different than just sort of like regular capitalism, right? One factor that I think is very important is the triumph of finance capital over industrial capital, right? That in an earlier phase of capitalism, we had corporations like, I don't know, you might imagine like Henry Ford, right? Henry Ford exploited lots of workers and made them work for like hell of hours all the time, and you know, exploited workers, made a bunch of profits for himself. But what he was doing fundamentally was making cars, right? Which is a real thing that you can sell, right? And that sort of produces a product that has value and that is useful in people's lives and sort of connected to like real production of a real thing, right? In late stage neoliberalism, we have more and more and more of our capital being directed towards finance, which is just money that makes money on itself without any relationship to actual production, right? So this, I put a picture of The Big Short because that's like a movie that does, I think, a good job of explaining sort of how, in the context of the 2007-2008 financial crisis, how like sort of financial machinations and financial products that really have nothing to do with the underlying fundamentals of like housing, right? Like people will need houses to live in, but nothing about the real economy really explains like what happened there. And so you basically just see a capture of more and more in our economy and more of our money going towards sort of finance and capital money being bound up into financial sort of products as opposed to being invested into things that might actually produce something, right? Some people also talk about sort of the asset stripping phase where like sort of the United States sort of had all this wealth and now it's kind of like just companies trying to come in and look for ways to dismantle and break apart things and sell them off for profit. It's globalized in a way that I think previous phases of capitalism are not. I mean, obviously, it's always sort of been, you know, global, whether you're talking about slave trade, you're talking about Dutch East India Company or anything. But what you really see, you know, in the neoliberal period is the rise of sort of transnational corporations that are really stateless. In a sense, like, you know, I guess nominally Apple is like a company belongs to the United States, but they have a lot of their money is incorporated in Ireland and Panama, and they do all their production in China because they can pay people's slavery wages or whatever. And so you get this kind of like total globalization and globalized supply chain and capital that kind of exists outside the control of any one nation state, which I think is a key feature of neoliberalism. I think another very important aspect of how neoliberalism is different than capitalism is sort of it's a psychological project, right? So it's meant to kind of so there's an intentional aspect to it, that this is a project that was taken on by people like the Koch brothers through places like the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute, who really like try to put these ideas into our national consciousness and into our way of thinking, such that even if you don't think that you believe these principles or these ideas of neoliberalism, they're sort of baked into the sort of the assumptions and the ground level truth that everyone in the United States is kind of operating from, right? And so it's a psychological project to get us to conceive everything, all of our social relations, as fundamentally market-based relations, right? So it's a way of getting us to think of ourselves only sort of fundamentally as consumers, as opposed to as like human beings, right? Everything is a firm, everything is a market, and all relations are transactional and profit-seeking, right? Which is pretty dystopian when you think about it. And so yeah, that basically what that a phrase that kind of captures that idea is the commodification of social relation, right? And the other key issue is that it's a governmental project, right? So neoliberalism is specifically about the relationship between the market and the state, the Western capitalist democracies, in a way that just straight up capitalism itself is really just a value form. It's not really, it's a way of seeking profit and a way of producing goods, and a relationship between people who own property and people who work. But this is so you can have lots of different types of governments that are capitalist governments, but neoliberalism is a specific way about influencing the government and sort of making the government serve the interests of the market, right? And I think a really key way to understand the way that it's a governmental project and the way that we think about that is the Citizens United case, right? So Citizens United is a Supreme Court decision that basically opened up the floodgates of corporate money even wider than they were before into our political process, and the legal principles that the Supreme Court cited basically when making this decision is that corporations are people and money is speech. So corporate money equals free speech and is protected by the First Amendment, right? So in that, you basically see this key idea that people and corporations are the same thing, and money and speech is the same thing, which I think if you think about from more than 4 seconds, you realize that's insane. That's bullshit. That doesn't make any sense. But under neoliberal ideology, right, like money is speech, right? That's the only way that you have of sort of conceiving of personal and social relations. So what are some examples of neoliberal policies, right? I gave some of them before, but just to talk a little bit more detail, shock therapy in Eastern Europe in the early 1990s. If I can just try to summarize that really quickly, basically, Soviet Union collapsed, right? And in the Soviet Union, basically, communist country, a lot of the industries and a lot of like functions and stuff were just run by the state, right? And so when the Soviet Union collapsed, you had sort of all of these industries that were to be privatized, right? Because we won the Cold War. So you had like the energy sector, the weapons sector, like all of these places where it used to be just run by the state, not for personal profit of corporations. And now you have sort of this mad scramble in the early 90s to sort of do that kind of asset stripping, capture these factories and capture these different industries, and basically create a new class of Russian oligarchs that really just went through and raided what had existed before there, as like sort of that caused like that had like basically a reasonable standard of living for people in Eastern Europe in the 1990s, right? it's really shocking because it really resulted in a serious hardship for the people of Eastern Europe, to the point where there was at least a 5-year drop in the average lifespan of people in those areas in the 1990s. So it was really difficult. That process resulted in just a lot of austerity and pain, and famines, and people not having enough money for food and bread, and just a real drop in the standard of living as a result of this process. Free trade agreements like NAFTA are also like a key part of the neoliberal agenda, right? So it's about sort of creating these international agreements that make the world safe for capital, that allow these corporations to go and build exploitative sort of relationships with people around the world. So basically, you have NAFTA, and basically a lot of corporations take their production facilities from the United States, move them into Mexico, where they can pay people a lot less money, and really use that to break the backs of good union jobs in the United States. Obamacare, I think, is a huge neoliberal example that I think it's important for people to understand, right? So Obamacare is basically, it just really fundamentally does not challenge the idea that the profit motive capitalist construction of the market for healthcare is the best way to organize a healthcare system, right? I think even a mild social democrat would agree that there's some things that are basically too important to be left to the market, and that we should probably be guaranteeing everybody some healthcare. But Obamacare says, okay, well, we probably should give everybody healthcare, but we really can't fundamentally challenge the idea that the healthcare system should be run by private enterprise, profit-seeking corporations, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to transfer a bunch of tax dollars to these corporations, and basically subsidize the premiums in order to get them to a low enough point that it will be affordable for more people to be able to also participate in the market, right? Which is just super backwards and complicated, and fundamentally, is ideologically limited in that it can't conceive of healthcare in any way outside of capitalism, and really is just ends up being a huge giant transfer of taxpayer dollars into the pockets of insurance companies. And your healthcare is still super fucking expensive, and it all sucks, and you didn't fix the problem at all. And if it really did fix the problem, we wouldn't still be talking about it literally 10 years after it got passed. So basically, I hate Obamacare. People who say that it's like a good thing, I have little patience for that. I mean, it's an iota better than what was there before, but it really doesn't do much to challenge the fundamental issues that we have in our healthcare system in the United States. And it's totally neoliberal. Attempts to cut benefits and privatize Social Security. This is something that comes up again and again, even though it's been kind of unsuccessful, because the thing about socialism is anytime you give people a little bit of socialism, they fucking love it, because it's like free money and good shit for people. And so it's not free money, but you know what I'm saying? It's a good thing. People like it when they get it because it's a good deal for regular people, right? And without fail, during the neoliberal period, all the presidents tries to come and be like, well, look, our demographics are changing. The Social Security is going to be insolvent. Like, there's this looming crisis. The budget crisis is going on. We probably have to cut Social Security benefits, right? And so they have not really been that successful in doing it because these programs are so popular. But this is something that Biden, W. Bush, and Obama have all tried to do. Attempts to dismantle the EPA. There's lots of attempts. I think that right now, I think that's like obviously top of mind given all the fires and everything that's going on. But basically, any kind of environmental regulations and stuff like that was put into place during the 1960s and 1970s was really seen as an obstacle to capital. And Trump puts a guy like Rick Perry, I think the idiot Texas guy, in charge of the EPA, who's literally was on TV saying like, I think the EPA shouldn't exist. So they're basically trying to destroy the post office, right? That's going on right now. That's totally neoliberal. They're trying to sort of like take apart and dismantle anything public, anything good, anything that limits capital or exists outside of the market is bad. Means testing. So that's kind of the thing where like you have to like qualify to like get something. So like you can't just get something for free because that's not fair, and the market has to decide if there's winners and losers. So you basically like like work requirements for welfare. So say like you don't deserve welfare if you don't work, so we're gonna try to like put on this requirement that you have to have a job if you get welfare. But it's like, okay, the whole point is that I can't get a job because there's no good jobs. Anyways, tax cuts for the rich. That's like the classic neoliberal thing. Like if you cut tax cuts for the rich, then they'll put more money into the economy and we'll all be better off, right? No, they just put the money in their pocket. Done. And then anything having to do with tax cuts, like even if it's tax cuts for you and me, that whole idea of a tax cut is fundamentally neoliberal, because what it means is that, well, if you like you use a tax cut to incentivize some other kind of behavior, which is basically submitting to the fundamental logic of like us as consumers, and like we take the extra money that we have here and then we will necessarily use that money for something else to achieve some other economic goal, right? The whole logic of tax cuts is fundamentally neoliberal. One thing that so how do you like recognize neoliberalism in the wild, right? So you can look for, I think these are some of the key buzzwords here that you can, when you hear these words, your ears should pick up and be like, okay, this is some neoliberal bullshit that we got here, right? Access, opportunity, affordable, right? So the Democrats don't want to give you healthcare. They want to give you the opportunity to access affordable healthcare. And it's like, okay, wait, what the fuck is that? You know, that's neoliberalism, right? Entrepreneurship, anytime people are talking about that, they're talking about you know, neoliberalism. They're talking about incentives. You want to incentivize people for doing things. All of that is neoliberal bullshit. Efficiency, competition, market. These are all words that if you hear these words, you should be a little thing in the back of your head that says like, oh, okay, I know what these people are talking about, right? My favorite, this is a banger from the Kamala Harris campaign that I loved. Yesterday, I announced as president, I established a student loan debt forgiveness program for Pell Grant recipients who start a business that operates for 3 years in disadvantaged communities, right? So you take, I don't even know how she came up with this shit, because that's just so, it's insane, right? So you have a problem of college costs too much, right? And poor people, specifically poor Black people, can't go to college because it's too expensive, right? So how do you fix that? Well, first you give them a loan, and then you promise to forgive the loan if they also apply for this other program that is a grant, and then they also have to start a business and participate in capitalism that way, and that business also has to operate for 3 years in a disadvantaged community. I'm sure that there are 1 or 2 people in the country that this applies to. But it's just so many gates and so many market integrations there that there's no way that a policy like this could ever, you know, sort of achieve the goal of making college more affordable in any way at all. So that was just a banger from Kamala. What are the consequences? You know, I'm going a little bit long, but I'll try to rush through these last ones. But I think it's really important to look at sort of like, you can look at any number of these economic graphs, and what you see is like a hockey stick pattern on the 1970s, where basically a whole bunch of shit about our economy just gets way worse for regular people, right? So this is a graph that I found somewhere of the median household incomes, right? Income kind of like stays pretty flat, but then you have this sort of like exponential growth of housing prices in San Francisco, such that there's just this divergence between how much a house costs and how much wages people are really owning. This is like, I think the key graph, I think, to understanding neoliberalism, right? And this is like what they've been able to do to our economy is make it so that the growth of the economy is totally decoupled from the growth of the real wages of working class people, right? So you have real median wages, right? So correcting for inflation, what the median wages for people are really not rising in any meaningful way since 1979, right? But our economy's grown, right? So there's more wealth and more everything, more money, right? More real wealth, but not almost, you know, pretty much none of that wealth is going to the working class, right? And you can see that in basically any kind of reasonable statistical analysis of what's been happening in our economy, you know, sort of since the 1970s, 1980s. And here's like another graph that shows kind of that distribution, where you have, you know, obviously more money going to the very, very small fraction of rich people, and not very much any of these economic gains really going to the working class. What you also see that I think is really important to understand is deindustrialization, right? So, um, and part of that shift away from industrial production into like financialized capital and everything like that is really just the complete death and gutting of the American Rust Belt and American manufacturing sectors, right? And so, I mean, everything that people say about Detroit, about how things, uh, the sort of the flight of capital from and production and those good union jobs in Michigan to places like Mexico and China and stuff like that. Really, really, really has kind of destroyed and devastated these communities and these places to like kind of really horrifying results. This movie, Roger and Me, is Michael Moore's first documentary. I would highly recommend it. It's a banger. But he basically uh, goes and tries to find the president of GM, whose name is Roger, and follow him around and ask him why he's fucking up Michael Moore's hometown of Flint, Michigan. Flint, Michigan is probably like the ground zero that for this kind of stuff. And it also brings to mind, I don't know if you listened to Trump's like inauguration speech, but he talked about like American carnage and the American wasteland. But you really just see kind of like a lot of pain and devastation kind of going into these places that formerly were, prosperous areas with a lot of good union jobs. So all of that is very long-winded and kind of meandering, but I hope it made some kind of sense. These are some of, I guess, like the key takeaways that I think I wish people sort of understood more about this period of time and sort of what this ruling ideology is. American politics are significantly to the right of where they were in the 1970s, right? So like this whole neoliberal project has just sort of pulled everything about our politics and what we can think of as even politically possible, sort of so far to the right that and it's really kind of shocking how complete and how total it was and it happened. And I think just people are kind of ignorant of this historical fact, and they kind of like look at something like Medicare for all, which really like isn't that radical of an idea, right? Like is literally what every single other major country in the world has. Nobody else is insane enough to try to do their healthcare system like we do. And for people to really go on TV and say that's too radical and that's not something that's possible to do, right? That's kind of nonsense. Bernie's ideas really are not extreme in any way at all. He's talking about mild social democratic reforms of a form that were supported by majorities of Americans as late as the 1960s and 1970s, right? So these ideas aren't like crazy. It's not crazy Bernie. He's not some radical communist, red, pinko guy. These are things that were completely mainstream, and it's just that we've had this sort of this intentional ideological pull of everything to the right and everything towards the free market that is really significant. A lot of our problems go back to Ronald Reagan. I think people try to memory hole a lot of stuff. People can't remember anything besides what happened in the last 2 weeks. But I mean, you really go back to what happened during the Reagan administration, and you see sort of the roots of things that blossomed and flowered during the Clinton, Bush, and Trump and Obama and Trump administrations, right? So I think you got to place a lot of blame for what's going on with us, right, squarely at the feet of Ronald Reagan. This is the ideology of the mainstream Democratic Party, right? So it's important to understand that this is a bipartisan consensus that both Democrats and Republicans sort of believe in this project. And if you don't like these things, then you're probably opposed to like the centrist Democrats. Another one thing that I think is really important is that the Clintons did this, right? Like it wasn't at all a foregone conclusion that this ideological revolution would completely capture the leadership of the Democratic Party, which formerly sort of did have its roots squarely in the working class and in sort of real leftist politics, right? But I think people just got their ass beat by Reagan so bad, right, that he was so popular that for whatever reason, the decision of the Clintons was that in order to beat the Republicans, what we should do is like just continue stepping to the right, right? And if we continue stepping to the right, then we'll just be able to like beat the dire Republicans, and that's how we'll win elections, right? And that's sort of been the project. And that's like a bad idea, and it didn't work, and it totally undermines the sort of mass base of the Democratic Party, and totally undermines the credibility of the Democratic Party when they say that they represent the interests of working people. And it's one of the major reasons that Hillary lost, right? Because I think people, you know, and Obama too is like a complete 100% like in this camp and in this sort of ideological project that isn't interested in actually taking on the interests of capital in any way at all, right? And that it's really kind of a betrayal, I think, of the working class that this has happened to the party that is supposed to represent them. And the other key thing that I think is really important to take in mind is that people's material conditions are getting worse, right? Like people's lives are getting worse. Infant mortality is increasing. Deaths of despair are increasing, and people are getting poorer, right? In this country, that's what's happening. Or they're getting the same amount of money and everything else is getting more expensive, right? And I think all of us can see that, right? Housing, healthcare, all these things are just getting more and more expensive every year. Our paychecks aren't growing at all. And so as a result, our lives are getting worse, right? And so it's a real structural crisis of capitalism. And also, it's probably a bad idea to tell people that America is already great, right? Like, this is a huge problem, right? And I think that any kind of like democratic messaging or left-wing messaging that sort of tries to minimize the real sort of pain and suffering that's going on out there in the world for regular working class people, I think is a bad idea, doomed to fail. The economy that we have is way shittier than the one our parents had. Like, I think we all say like fuck boomers, but like, that's like I was saying before, like college costs like a nickel and you could buy a house for like $37 in San Francisco. That's just not what we have right now. The economy is like sort of objectively getting much worse than it was in the past. And also, I would say be skeptical of arguments that start with, do you really trust the government, right? Because I think a lot of times people are like, do you really trust the government to yada, yada, yada? Do you really trust the government to like do your healthcare or whatever? But that's a psyop. That's these people trying to like convince you that you should do more neoliberalism. And I think that whole framing of the conversation like is kind of suspect, right? And this ideology is ubiquitous, and I think we must deprogram ourselves so much about the way that we're taught to think about ourselves, sort of as consumers. Consumption as activism and stuff is sort of rooted in this ideology, and it's really incumbent upon ourselves to sort of deprogram from these thought patterns. So with that, I'm going to stop recording, stop sharing.